Here's what I think is going on with Apple. I think that they're basically playing chicken with creatives in general. And when I say creatives, I mean, yes, those creators on Patreon that are being squeezed by Apple, as I talked about in my previous video. But I also mean creatives in the sense of developers. When I was like in 5th and 6th grade, in the summer between those 2 years, I got really into YouTube. 5th grade, I saw all my friends on YouTube. YouTube was just on the upswing, and I asked my parents if I could make a YouTube channel at that point. And they kind of looked at me funny, and they were a little skeptical and a little concerned, but I convinced them, and I used their video camera to make my first YouTube video, which was just a silly skit with my friends that I'm very embarrassed about. But it was the beginning of something there. And my interest in video kind of continued ever since. I mean, my mom is an art teacher. She has made art present in my life, and creativity my entire life. My dad was an engineer. And as I graduated from high school, where I also studied film, I went into college knowing that I wanted to do something more technical. And I thought that it was something in relation to engineering. And so I went in thinking maybe electrical engineering, mechanical engineering. Wasn't really sure. I didn't really know what the scope of things were in that regard. And I just sort of stumbled in my second quarter in college into a class. I stumbled into an intro to programming class, and it felt very technical to me. And it scratched all the right itches in my brain. But what I did not expect is to feel as creative as I did taking that course. And so I took the second one, and then I became a teacher assistant, and then I got into the major, and then I graduated with a degree in computer science. And one of the most interesting things that I learned during that period was just how creative a discipline computer science actually is. Like I said, it scratched all those right itches. It was the right balance between the technical and the creativity piece. And the reason I say that Apple is playing chicken with creatives in general is because the Patreon thing that I discussed before and that's going on and that has been in the news lately is just the latest example of that, of something that has been felt by the developer community, the Apple developer community, for years now. Like literally almost 15, well actually over 15 years at this point. And here's the thing about it. Apple going in and taking their 30% from Patreon and thus 30% from creators who are using Patreon on iOS and other Apple platforms is well within Apple's rights. There's nothing legally wrong about it, right? And actually in some ways, it's Apple setting their own boundaries for themselves. It's maintaining a consistent platform for all of the other developers out there who thought that they should. I mean, FanHouse tried to make a Patreon competitor, and they were kicked off because they wanted to use third-party payment rather than the Apple payment. Patreon could leave. They could go to the web if they wanted to. And Apple believes that if Patreon really thinks that Apple's platform is valuable, that they'd be willing to pay that 30%. And they'll build a business around that. And that's what I mean by Apple playing chicken. They're saying, we think that our customers are so valuable that you, Patreon, and thus you creators, should pay to access their wallets, basically. And again, Patreon could leave. They could just go to the web. And some people have called for them to do that. I think that Fortnite is a good example of this. Apple thinks that their platform is so valuable that, for example, even a company like Epic Games shouldn't necessarily get a free ride, right? Even though they have probably the most popular game in the world, right? Fortnite. And Apple played chicken with them, and Apple played chicken right back. And guess what Epic did? They pulled their apps from the App Store. It's a great example of what Patreon could do. Now, Epic Games is a special company. Tim Sweeney, who runs Epic, is on kind of a crusade in some ways, and so it's not something that's generally applicable, but it shows that that is what Apple's banking on. And because of that, I cannot play my favorite games on the iPhone and on the iPad and on Apple Vision Pro and on my Apple TV. And so the decisions that Apple makes do affect their customers even more than monetarily. And Apple believes that their decisions are the right ones for their business and for their customers. We'll get to that in a second. One reason for this is because Apple really thinks of their phone, in particular the iPhone, as a feature phone, right? Let me give you a second to think about this, but what do you think the most used, I think by time, I don't know if it's by opens or by time, used apps are on the iPhone from, let's say, the top like 10 or so. I bet you can't even guess the first one, which is the phone. The phone app is actually the most used. And then there's weather, camera, clock, messages, calculator, the App Store. And then finally, all the way down, the first third-party app that people use on their phone the most is YouTube. You have to get way down that list before you even see a third-party app, which is interesting. And so in Apple's eyes, they have made a phone. And remember, that's how the phone started at the beginning. It did not have a third-party app store. The third-party development story was the web in the first place. And so by creating this platform for developers, Apple basically thinks of those third-party applications as gravy on top of the iPhone. I mean, I think Jobs famously said that the iPhone's killer application was the phone. It wasn't the App Store, it wasn't the web, it was the phone, right? They married an iPod and a phone, which is what everybody wanted. So in review, Patreon could leave, like Fortnite did. Apple thinks that's okay because applications in their mind are kind of gravy on top of the core iPhone experience. Whether that's true or not, customers will decide. And that leads us to one of the most important principles about Apple as you look at this, that you can know to understand how they're behaving at any given moment. I think that John Gruber is the one that kind of codified this, but he says Apple has this priority list of the parties that are involved with their platform that they think are important, and they prioritize different needs accordingly to this ladder. At the very top is Apple themselves. If Apple's not healthy, and if they're not making a buck, if it's not successful for them, if they can't rationalize it for themselves, then they will take care of themselves first. That's what all companies do. It's the greedy part of a company, right? But there's also some truth to that. Even personally, I believe that there's some room for healthy narcissism. After Apple comes the customer. One of the most important philosophies at Apple is that you prioritize the customer, and you really do that in a very true, empathetic way. So anything that is good for the customer in Apple's eyes is likely good for Apple. Now, of course, there are compromises there. I mean, customers don't like for money to be taken out of their pockets. They don't like paying lots of money for really premium products, but Apple believes that they're providing enough value that customers perceive that value as a quality exchange. And there's all sorts of other things that Apple does for their customers that show their commitment to customers as the second most important thing to them. And then only after that do developers matter. Because Apple believes that if they're doing what's good for them and they're doing what's good for the customer, that developers will follow because it's also probably good for developers. This leaves developers as a third priority in a lot of ugly squeezes. And developers are very vocal about that being the bottom of the priority list. I think this is hurting them in other areas, like in terms of the Apple Vision Pro. I think this is potentially going to hurt them long term if they don't change their strategy. But a lot of developers don't put their money where their mouth is and leave the platform like Fortnite does. And then only after all of those, as we've seen, is the creators. The creators are almost all the way at the very bottom of that, right? Sometimes those creators are, developers themselves, sometimes they're customers themselves, but creators are a distant thought from Apple because it's just not their business to care about the creators, despite their claim of being at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. And so remember that. Apple, customer, developer, creator. So I want to think about how Apple developed this philosophy. And the reason that it happened is because of the way that their history sort of tracks it. I've talked about this before, but remember, at the beginning, their devices were the thing that they sold. Apple as a company, they had to make devices in order for anything to be sold at the beginning, right? That's why they put themselves first, is because they kicked this whole thing off, at least in their eyes. And then the second thing that happened after that is that they had some customers. In the beginning, it was the Homebrew Computer Club, and then a small electronics shop in Silicon Valley. And so at the beginning, it was all about Apple and their customers. And guess what? It really took off. Now, they weren't naive. Apple recognized that the reason, for example, the Apple II took off was because a very savvy developer brought the energy, the creative energy of the market into their product. And so they realized, hey, if we make this thing that's good enough for a bunch of customers, then, as long as those customers are developing something for it, then we'll get a opportunity in the market to sell a killer app and have our devices be the ones that take off rather than the competitors. And so they thought, oh, well, we got Apple, we've got our customers. Those customers at the beginning, in my eyes, are developers, which I think Apple might be missing. But we've got these really dedicated power users, these people who love being on the cutting edge, who will eventually become customers, and after that, only as developers, right? You think about this, at the top, it benefits Apple because they get the money, right? They get, of course, makes a lot of sense. If you think about the iPhone, of course, say that you make this great product, you make an iPod, you make something that's a great consumer application, and a bunch of people will buy it, and you'll make plenty of dough. That, of course, also benefits the consumer, because guess what? Customers, they come along and they have a solution to a problem that they have. With the iPod, it was carrying a bunch of portable songs with you. With the iPhone, it was combining the iPod and the phone. But it also develops this sense of trust between the customer and Apple when Apple prioritizes the customer first, right? If Apple was always prioritizing developers' needs before customers, well, then some things might happen that developers are not representative for. And so that's why Apple puts customers second. It also helps with focus, right? Part of that trust building is this quality. And part of quality is having a focus on the things that you really care about. And for Apple, they're a limited organization. They're huge. They make a lot of money, but they're made of humans. It's an organization like any other. And if there's anything we know, it's that big bureaucratic organizations often have blind spots. And so the more things you say no to, the better it is for the company, because the better quality the things they can create. The App Store is the logical extension of this. Apple, basically by charging everybody 30%, has said there's a whole category of apps that we are okay with basically foregoing in this case. The business models won't make sense here. We're going to carve out certain exceptions for these really big things like Netflix and Kindle. But for the most part, we're going to just say, if you can't take a 30% margin and then also make a profit on top of that, then this place is probably not for you. So that, in Apple's eyes, is focus, because they're saying no. They're drawing that boundary to a bunch of people. And then in theory, anything that benefits the consumer, the customer, also benefits the developer. And Apple built this mindset with the App Store because guess what? Apple thought, well, we're starting with ourselves first. We really want to make a phone. We're going to make a phone that is an iPod. It's a great combination of those two things. It also has Safari on there, so it's going to be an internet communicator, as Steve Jobs said. And it's going to benefit the customers because they want that. They want that more than anything. And guess what? The phone is going to be the killer app on this thing. People already love their iPod. They already love their phone. We're just going to make the best combination of the two. Benefits Apple, benefits customers. And at the beginning, developers weren't even in the picture. Remember that. Developers were entirely on the side at that point. And then they open up the App Store. And they thought, well, it's exemplified by this story that, guess what? Developers are an afterthought when it comes to the iPhone. It just so happens that, number one, iPhone was an extremely well-built, extremely successful product with a killer app built into it. And number two, the App Store put gasoline on that fire. Developers, I think, would argue that the App Store is the killer app for the iPhone. I bet you that Apple would almost say no to that, it is hard to ignore that the App Store drives so much of their services revenue, and that services revenue is taking off. It almost rivals the iPhone revenue, and it actually does rival the iPhone revenue in some cases. That said, it is built on the back of the iPhone, and so Apple believes that their hardware and their firmware is the most important thing, and that the software comes a distant third. So, benefits Apple because of money. Benefits the customer because it builds trust, and a more focused product is a higher quality product. And it benefits developers because those first two things, having a giant group of really high value consumers, is a very attractive target for developers because they also want those consumers' dollars as well. And so Apple thinks that this is the right ordering, and I think that based off of their success, it'd be hard to argue against it. But it's important to remember, it is not a binary decision about whether something works or something doesn't. There's a range of possibilities across a range of different categories of things that might make a difference as Apple grows even further into, for example, other product categories like the Apple Vision Pro. So let's work in reverse. How does that mindset hurt developers? How does it hurt customers? And how does it hurt Apple? Well, when it comes to developers lose a lot of flexibility. Because Apple stays focused on a few things, developers make it so that they can't build everything that they could possibly want to. I mean, this is perfectly exemplified by the iPhone versus the Android operating system, right? The iPhone, relatively speaking, is kind of limited to a certain group of things that Apple believes is okay to build, right? There's enough flexibility that there's new innovative things that Apple never could have guessed, but their technology combined with their policies and their monetary procedures, as well as their ownership of the customer relationship, makes it so that only certain types of things can be built on the iPhone, which to some eyes is a good thing, to some eyes is anti-competitive or a bad thing, and to, I guess, the world is just extremely successful as a strategy. What you think probably differs. Android, to an extent, has a similar lockdown nature, but it is much more open. This is the thing that we would talk about with Android. I mean, it's open source, right? So even different vendors have availability for different things, right? But because of that, devs have tons of flexibility, right? Apple thinks that that lack of flexibility is a small price to pay for the focus and quality that they bring to their products. Okay, but it does hurt developers. Customers, how does it hurt customers? Well, with a lack of flexibility comes, to an extent, a lack of choice. If there are certain apps that can't make it onto the App Store, well, customers have fewer choices about what apps are available to them. And then, of course, for Apple, because they prioritize the customer, that hurts them in the end as well. Because anything that you can have on an Android, like Fortnite, for example, right, and that you cannot have on the iPhone, becomes a differentiator for Android as a platform and becomes a competitive disadvantage to the iPhone and the iOS platform and their ecosystem of devices, if that app is important enough. Remember that list of things, if it was like phone, messages, App Store, kind of towards the bottom, and then the very first third-party app was YouTube? If YouTube wasn't on the iPhone, how well would the iPhone do? I mean, it might do well. People might just go to the web. But I bet you people would be frustrated. And with enough of those little paper cuts comes the risk that Apple is bearing by maintaining control over the app ecosystem on their phones, which is that with enough of those paper cuts, people may eventually choose to switch. There is competition in the market, and I think that that is how Apple defines the market, is between Android and iPhone, not apps as a whole. They think of the product as the phone. At their core, they sell hardware. Even as their services skyrocket, they see those services as built on the back of the hardware that they build. And so, Apple is predisposed to think that the level of competition is along that plane. The plane of hardware, not the plane of firmware, not necessarily even the plane of software, the product that they actually ship, which is the hardware that they sell. Here's the problem with all of that. Yes, Apple does benefit from focusing on their customers first. Yes, their products are probably good enough to sell on their own, but Also, this market is mature now. There is a lot more that happens in this market than just the phone and the App Store. And here's the problem with that. Yes, Apple does benefit a ton from focusing on their customers so much, but this is a mature market now. It's more complicated than the original days of the iPhone. We're no longer in the stages of it being a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator. There's also an app store that has complex social networking where a lot of our discourse happens. There are life-saving apps that Apple loves to highlight on the App Store. There is Apple has their own ecosystem of apps that is increasingly sprawling. And yes, the iPhone probably still is a feature phone, but by not having people's favorite things on their phone, by taking cuts from the creators that people really love and trust, the market is starting to see some of those paper cuts that the developers have been seeing all along, which means that the decisions that Apple is making is ultimately not good for its customers for the most part. And I think that their idea of what is good for the customers is relatively narrow. Right now, with what they've decided to do, I'd say that, it's still only a couple of drops in a bucket. But if the behavior continues, it's very possible that something else will come along that people cared enough about that will make a difference when it's no longer on an iPhone and suddenly forces their hand. We've started to see some of this stuff with what's going on in the EU, with the EU's regulations, with alternate app stores, like things like emulators, game emulators have become, were going to be allowed in the European Union. And so Apple's hand was forced because that was going to be something that would have been very attractive to other customers in the EU to download those alternative app stores. And so now Apple, in some ways, it feels like they've had their hand forced to make those types of decisions. But it's honestly bigger than that. It comes down to perception, and it comes down to one of the things that when Steve Jobs was coming back to Apple in, I think it was 97 or around then, that he said was one of the core assets that the company still had. One of them, he said, was Mac OS, right? And that's still kind of true to this day. In fact, his company, Next, is the one that they did the brain transplant of the Mac, right? And made the next generation of Mac software that basically still powers your phone and our iPads and everything we have that's Apple related to this day. But the other one, not even necessarily the talent at the company, not necessarily the great industrial design team that they had, although he did call that out as well, but the brand. He called out the brand as one of the most important assets that Apple had. And a brand is what you're known for. It's what you do, right? And the way that Apple is behaving is creating all of these little nicks in what their brand image used to be. And in particular, because some of that is so core to the way that Apple thinks of itself, that is that they help creatives, for example, or they have the most cutting edge technology, or in some cases that they do the best thing for the consumers. Well, when you start making those compromises and liquidating those out into dollars and cents is exactly when you start eating away at the value of the brand. In some ways, brand is representative of the value that you left on the table, right? You pay a lot of money for an iPhone, but you get a lot back, as I said before. And I think in Apple's calculus, they've almost always given you back more than what you paid. That's how much they believe in their products. I'm not sure that calculus is true anymore. And as we lose things like Epic Games, video games on the App Store, as we get things like developers getting frustrated with platforms, you start to run into these issues where the brand with some of your most important core constituents is going to stagnate you in other areas. The biggest one of which right now is Apple Vision Pro, right? That's how this channel started, right? I started talking about Apple Vision Pro, and it was immediately clear to me that the developer appetite for something like Apple Vision Pro was much smaller than what it was for the iPhone. Really, it's not a revolutionary take. Of course it was. Everybody wanted an iPhone. Basically, nobody wants a VR headset. But that's exactly why it's so important that Apple's brand speaks to those things in relation to their most important constituents, which in my opinion are their developers, at least for the Apple Vision Pro. And so as Apple goes forward, I hope that, the steward of the App Store, Phil Schiller, one of the guys who's been around the longest there and who cares the most about Apple's brand, recognizes, I'm sure he does, but I hope that he recognizes from the outside how it looks. Because my concern is that maybe he's lost a little bit of touch.